Aisha, a 10-year-old black girl with determined brown eyes and messy hair, sat at the kitchen table. The dim light flickered above her as she hunched over a worn-out math notebook, her lips moving silently while solving a problem. Each stroke of her pencil seemed deliberate, as if every number and symbol etched onto the page was a step toward a better life. The quiet, however, shattered abruptly. A loud slam of the front door reverberated through the small apartment, making her pencil jerk off the page. Her father's voice, sharp and booming, followed almost immediately. "You always think you're right, don't you?" he barked. Her mother's equally harsh response echoed back. "And you never stop to think about what you're ruining." Aisha froze, gripping her pencil tightly, her knuckles turning white. Her brown eyes flickered toward the notebook, trying to block out the noise. Numbers made sense. Arguments didn't. The shouting escalated, each accusation slicing through the air like a knife. She bit her lip and tried to refocus on her math problem. The numbers blurred, but she refused to give in to the chaos. It wasn't just a problem on a page, it was her lifeline. Her whispered words were barely audible over the yelling. "One day, I'll get out of here." The yelling in the kitchen grew louder, echoing off the worn-out walls. Aisha sat frozen, her pencil hovering above the notebook. "Why is it always my fault?" her father's voice thundered, shaking the small room. "Because you never take responsibility for anything," her mother shot back, her words sharp and cutting. Aisha's shoulders tensed. She gripped the pencil tighter, pressing its tip so hard against the page that it broke. The snapping sound jolted her, but it wasn't enough to drown out the storm raging around her. Her father's voice boomed again. "You're tearing this family apart. And you think you're holding it together?" her mother countered, her voice shaking with anger. Isha's chest tightened as she tried to focus on the half-solved equation in front of her. Numbers always stayed the same. They didn't yell or accuse, but now even they felt slippery, elusive. "Aisha, go to your room." Her mother's voice cut through the noise, directed at her this time. Aisha hesitated, her eyes still on the notebook. "I just want to finish this," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Now!" her father barked, his tone final. Swallowing the lump in her throat, Aisha quietly gathered her things and stood. The argument continued behind her as she walked to her room, her steps heavy and slow. She held the broken pencil tightly in her hand, as if it were the only thing holding her together. Aisha pushed open the door to her small room, the noise from the kitchen fading to a muffled roar. She let out a shaky breath and stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Her room was her only refuge, a space painted a faded blue with walls that seemed to absorb her pain. The narrow window let in a faint sliver of moonlight, illuminating the rows of old books stacked on makeshift shelves. She sank to the floor, crossing her legs and opening her notebook again. Her fingers brushed the torn edges of the pages, and she picked up a new pencil from her small stash. The math problem stared back at her, incomplete but familiar. "One day, all of this will change," she whispered to herself, her voice low but steady. The words felt like a promise, one she was determined to keep. As she began solving the problem again, the shouting outside turned into background noise. Her pencil moved smoothly, filling the page with lines and numbers that brought order to her chaotic world. Math wasn't just a subject to Aisha, it was her escape, a place where problems had solutions and everything made sense. Here, in the sanctuary of her room, she could dream of something better, something far away from the arguments that filled the rest of the house. The night stretched on, but Aisha stayed rooted to her spot, her focus unwavering. Every problem she solved felt like a small step toward the future she so desperately wanted. The next morning, Aisha walked into her school's math classroom, clutching her worn-out notebook. She slid into her usual seat in the second row, close enough to see the board clearly, but far enough to avoid drawing too much attention. Around her, the hum of chatter filled the room as students settled into their seats. Isha's gaze remained fixed on her notebook, reviewing her notes from the previous night. To her, math was more than just numbers. It was a chance to prove herself in a world that often felt stacked against her. The door swung open, and the chatter died instantly. Miss Thompson, the school's strictest teacher, strode in with her usual air of authority. She was a tall woman with sharp features, her dark eyes scanning the room like a hawk. Miss Thompson was known for her no-nonsense approach, and while many students feared her, Aisha admired her precision. "Good morning, class," Miss Thompson said, her voice firm. "Today we'll be diving into complex equations." She turned to the board and began writing swiftly, her chalk strokes deliberate and neat. Aisha followed every line, her pencil moving in tandem with Miss Thompson's writing. The classroom felt like a different world to her, one where she wasn't just a girl from a chaotic home, but someone capable of solving problems and excelling. "Can anyone tell me the next step?" Miss Thompson asked, turning to face the class. Aisha's hand shot up before anyone else had a chance. Miss Thompson's eyes narrowed slightly and she nodded. "Go ahead, Aisha. The variable needs to be isolated first," Aisha said confidently. Miss Thompson gave a curt nod, but her lips tightened, as if acknowledging Aisha's answer took effort. The other students exchanged glances, sensing the subtle tension. While Aisha respected Miss Thompson, she could feel a wall between them, a clash of personalities that neither had acknowledged outright. Despite this, Aisha's passion for math burned brighter, undeterred by the teacher's cold demeanor. As the lesson continued, Aisha stayed focused, determined to prove herself, not just to Miss Thompson, but to the world that had underestimated her. The classroom buzzed with quiet concentration as Miss Thompson continued her lesson, filling the board with a series of complex equations. Aisha's pencil moved quickly, jotting down each step with precision. She felt at ease here, where logic ruled over chaos. Miss Thompson paused, stepping back to survey her work on the board. "Now, class, pay close attention. This formula will guide us through the next set of problems," she said, her tone sharp and commanding. Aisha's brow furrowed as she studied the equation. Something was off. She tilted her head, double-checking her notes. The error was clear. The variable should have been in the numerator, not the denominator. For a moment she hesitated, remembering Miss Thompson's stern demeanor. But her sense of logic wouldn't let her stay silent. She raised her hand. "Excuse me, Miss Thompson," Aisha said, her voice steady but polite. "I think there's a mistake in the formula. The variable should be in the numerator." The classroom fell silent. All eyes turned to Aisha, and a few students exchanged nervous glances. Miss Thompson's expression hardened as she turned to face her. "A mistake?" Miss Thompson repeated, her tone laced with disbelief. "You think you know better than your teacher?" Aisha blinked, caught off guard by the sharpness of the response. "No, ma'am," she replied carefully. "I just thought it might need correcting." Miss Thompson crossed her arms, her gaze piercing. "Let me remind you, Aisha, that I am the teacher. Your job is to learn, not to question me." Her voice was cold, her words cutting deeper than intended. Aisha's cheeks burned, but she kept her head up. She nodded slightly and lowered her gaze to her notebook, pretending to take notes. The tension in the room was palpable, and even the students who usually whispered behind their books stayed silent. Miss Thompson turned back to the board, continuing the lesson as if nothing had happened. But her tone was sharper, her movements stiffer. Aisha, however, couldn't shake the knot in her chest. She hadn't meant to disrespect her teacher. She'd only wanted to help. By the time the bell rang, Aisha had packed her things in silence. She lingered as the other students filed out, their curious stares brushing past her. Miss Thompson erased the board with quick, deliberate strokes, avoiding Aisha's gaze. As Aisha left the classroom, her steps were steady, but inside she felt a storm brewing. She didn't regret speaking up, but for the first time, she wondered if her intelligence was a gift or a burden. The hallway was crowded with students, their chatter and laughter creating a stark contrast to the silence Aisha carried within her. She walked quickly, clutching her notebook to her chest, her mind replaying the confrontation in class. Each word from Miss Thompson echoed in her head, sharp and unrelenting. "You think you know better than your teacher?" Aisha reached her locker and leaned against it for a moment, her fingers tightening around the edges of the notebook. She took a deep breath, trying to push the memory away, but the knot in her chest refused to loosen. In the classroom, Miss Thompson stood alone, staring at the equations she had erased moments earlier. Her hand lingered on the chalkboard, her thoughts betraying the confident image she projected. Deep down, she knew Aisha had been right. The mistake was obvious now, but admitting it felt impossible. "What was I thinking?" Miss Thompson muttered to herself. She paced the empty room, her heels clicking against the floor. It wasn't just Aisha's correction that unsettled her. It was the precision and confidence in the girl's tone. Aisha wasn't just any student. She was brilliant, and Miss Thompson couldn't ignore it. But instead of embracing it, she had lashed out. Meanwhile, Aisha found a quiet corner in the library, sitting at a table tucked between towering bookshelves. She opened her notebook and stared at the math problem she had been working on the night before. The numbers blurred as her mind wandered back to the confrontation. Was I wrong to speak up? She thought, tracing the edges of her pencil with her fingers. Her logical mind knew the answer. She had been right. But the reaction she'd received made her second-guess herself. The library door creaked open, and Aisha instinctively hunched over her notebook, trying to disappear. A few students passed by, whispering, their eyes darting in her direction. She could feel their pity and curiosity like a weight pressing down on her. Back in the classroom, Miss Thompson sat at her desk, her head in her hands. She thought about Aisha's determination, the way her hands shot up before anyone else's, and the quiet confidence in her voice. For the first time, Miss Thompson questioned her own actions, her own insecurities. Later that evening, Aisha sat at her kitchen table again, the faint light of her lamp illuminating the pages of her notebook. Her parents' argument from earlier had subsided into an uneasy silence. She picked up her pencil and started solving another problem. Numbers don't judge, she whispered to herself, the words barely audible. They don't yell. They don't fight. With each line she wrote, the tension eased slightly. Math wasn't just her escape. It was her armor. It gave her control in a world where so much felt uncontrollable. In the solitude of their respective spaces, both Aisha and Miss Thompson reflected on the same moment, each feeling the weight of their own struggles. Neither of them knew it yet, but that confrontation would mark the beginning of an unexpected change in both their lives. The next day, Aisha walked into the classroom, her notebook tucked tightly under her arm. Her steps were steady, but the memory of yesterday's confrontation lingered in her mind. She took her usual seat in the second row, her gaze focused on the board as Miss Thompson entered the room. "Good morning, class," Miss Thompson said, her voice as firm as ever. She turned to the board, writing out a fresh equation. The chalk moved quickly, forming a problem more complex than the ones they had tackled before. Aisha copied the equation into her notebook, her pencil gliding across the page. But as she analyzed the steps Miss Thompson was explaining, a familiar unease settled in her chest. The teacher had made another mistake. This time the variables were misaligned, throwing off the entire solution. Aisha's heart raced. She remembered the sharpness in Miss Thompson's tone the day before, and the humiliation that followed. She hesitated, her hand hovering over her desk. Was it worth pointing it out again? She took a deep breath. This wasn't about ego or defiance. It was about getting the math right. Slowly, she raised her hand. "Yes, Aisha," Miss Thompson asked, her tone clipped. "Excuse me, Miss Thompson," Aisha began, her voice calm but firm. "I think there's a mistake in the setup. Shouldn't the denominator be simplified first?" The room went silent. A few students exchanged wary glances, anticipating the teacher's reaction. Miss Thompson set down her chalk, turning to face Aisha. Her expression was colder than before. "You again," she said, her words heavy with restrained impatience. "Since you seem so confident, how about you solve this?" Miss Thompson stepped aside, revealing a new equation on the board. This one was far more advanced, the kind of problem usually reserved for college-level classes. The room tensed as the challenge hung in the air. Aisha hesitated. Her classmates' eyes were on her, some curious, others sympathetic. Slowly she stood, her legs feeling heavier with each step toward the board. She picked up the chalk, her fingers trembling slightly as she examined the problem. Miss Thompson crossed her arms, her gaze fixed on Aisha. "Go ahead," she said, her tone sharp. "Let's see if your brilliance matches your confidence." Aisha took a deep breath and began to write. The chalk felt foreign in her hand. But as she worked through the equation, her focus sharpened. Each step felt deliberate, the logic unfolding in her mind like a familiar pattern. The classroom was silent except for the faint scratching of chalk against the board. Aisha's confidence grew with each line, her movements more assured. She blocked out the stares, the tension, even Miss Thompson's glare. This was her world, one where problems had solutions. When she finished, Aisha set the chalk down and stepped back. "Solved," she said quietly, her voice steady. Miss Thompson approached the board, her eyes scanning the solution. Line by line, she analyzed Aisha's work, her expression shifting from skepticism to quiet astonishment. The answer was flawless. For a moment, Miss Thompson stood frozen. The silence in the room felt heavier than ever. Then the bell rang, breaking the tension. Without a word, Miss Thompson turned back to the board, erasing the equation with quick, precise movements. Aisha returned to her seat, her classmates whispering as they packed their things. She kept her head down, her heart still racing. She hadn't sought to prove anything, but in solving that problem, she'd made a statement. Miss Thompson, still by the board, hesitated before erasing the last line. Deep down, she knew the truth. Aisha wasn't just brilliant, she was extraordinary. And for the first time, Miss Thompson felt something unfamiliar, respect mixed with the faint stirrings of regret. The day after the confrontation, the atmosphere in the classroom was tense but quieter. Aisha sat in her usual seat, her notebook open, her pencil poised. She focused intently as Miss Thompson began the lesson, but there was a noticeable stiffness in the teacher's tone. The events of the previous day hung in the air like an unspoken weight. Miss Thompson continued explaining a set of equations on the board. The numbers flowed smoothly at first, but then she paused, rechecked her work, and hesitated. Aisha's sharp eyes caught the mistake almost instantly, but this time, she didn't raise her hand. She simply lowered her gaze and continued taking notes, unwilling to risk another confrontation. The pause in Miss Thompson's explanation stretched a moment too long. She turned to face the class, her sharp eyes scanning the room until they landed on Aisha. Aisha, she said, her voice carrying a challenge, you've been eager to correct me before. Is there a problem with this equation? The question made the entire room freeze. Aisha hesitated, her heart pounding. She hadn't planned to speak, but now every pair of eyes was on her. Slowly, she looked up. Yes, Miss Thompson, Aisha said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. I think the denominator needs to be simplified first. Miss Thompson's jaw tightened. She stepped away from the board and gestured toward it. Fine. Why don't you come up and solve it, Aisha? The equation she wrote next was longer and more complex than anything Aisha had ever seen in class. It was a problem meant for advanced college students, not middle schoolers. The room collectively held its breath as Miss Thompson stepped aside, her arms crossed. Aisha stared at the board, the weight of the challenge sinking in. The numbers blurred for a moment, but then she took a deep breath and stood. Her legs felt heavy as she walked to the front of the room. Picking up the chalk, she faced the board and studied the problem. Miss Thompson watched her intently, her expression unreadable. Whenever you're ready, she said, her tone sharp. Aisha's hand moved cautiously at first, her mind racing through potential solutions. The room was silent except for the faint sound of chalk scratching against the board. As she worked, her movements became more deliberate, each step flowing into the next. What had initially seemed impossible now began to take shape. The students whispered quietly, their eyes wide with disbelief. Even Miss Thompson couldn't hide her surprise as Aisha moved with growing confidence. She didn't falter, didn't hesitate. Every symbol she wrote was precise, every calculation flawless. Finally, Aisha set the chalk down and stepped back. Solved, she said, her voice calm but firm. Miss Thompson approached the board slowly, her eyes scanning Aisha's work. She checked each line, each step, her expression shifting from skepticism to something closer to awe. By the time she reached the final answer, she couldn't deny it. Aisha had solved the problem perfectly. The classroom erupted into murmurs of astonishment. Some students clapped quietly, while others simply stared at Aisha as if seeing her for the first time. Aisha, however, didn't bask in the attention. She returned to her seat, her hands trembling slightly as she opened her notebook. Miss Thompson stood by the board, frozen in place. The piece of chalk in her hand felt strangely heavy as she stared at the solved equation. Aisha's brilliance had been undeniable, and for the first time, Miss Thompson felt a pang of something unfamiliar: humility. As the bell rang and students began to leave, Miss Thompson remained by the board, lost in thought. Aisha packed her things quietly, slipping out of the room without looking back. Later that evening, Miss Thompson sat at her desk, staring at a blank sheet of paper. Her mind replayed the moment over and over. The confidence in Aisha's voice, the flawless solution on the board. She had underestimated the girl, and now she couldn't ignore her potential. In her room, Aisha sat on the floor, her notebook open in front of her. She traced the edges of the pages, the day's events still fresh in her mind. For the first time, she allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't about proving Miss Thompson wrong. It was about proving to herself that she was capable of more than anyone had ever imagined. Unbeknownst to Aisha, Miss Thompson was making a decision that would change everything. The following day, Aisha entered the classroom, unsure of what to expect. The tension from the previous confrontation still lingered, but Miss Thompson seemed different. Her usual rigid posture softened ever so slightly as she began the lesson, and her tone carried less of the sharpness Aisha had come to expect. "Aisha," Miss Thompson called out after class as the other students filed out. Aisha froze, gripping her notebook tightly. "Stay for a moment, please." Aisha hesitated but nodded, walking to the front of the room. Miss Thompson waited until the last student left before turning to face her. Her expression was unreadable, but her voice was calm. "I owe you an apology," she said, the words deliberate and sincere. "I was too harsh on you, and I let my pride get in the way. Your work yesterday was extraordinary." Aisha blinked, surprised by the unexpected acknowledgement. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice tinged with hesitation. Miss Thompson took a deep breath. "You have a rare talent, Aisha. It's clear that math isn't just a subject for you. It's something you excel at in ways most people can't. I want to help you develop that talent further." "What do you mean?" Aisha asked, her curiosity piqued. "There's a national mathematics competition coming up," Miss Thompson explained. "It's a platform for students like you to showcase their skills, and it could open doors to scholarships and opportunities. But it's incredibly challenging. You'd need to put in a lot of extra work." Aisha's heart raced. The idea of competing on such a large stage was exciting, but it also felt overwhelming. "Do you think I could really do it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wouldn't suggest it if I didn't believe in you," Miss Thompson replied firmly. "But this will take dedication and effort. I'm willing to work with you after school to prepare, if you're willing." Aisha nodded slowly, determination settling in her chest. "I'll do it," she said. "I want to try." From that day on, their dynamics shifted. Miss Thompson wasn't just a strict teacher anymore. She became a mentor. After school, the two of them worked together in the empty classroom, tackling advanced problems and puzzles. Miss Thompson pushed Aisha to think beyond the textbook, encouraging her to approach challenges with creativity and confidence. "You've got the logic down," Miss Thompson said one evening, as Aisha worked through a particularly tough problem. "Now let's focus on speed and accuracy." Aisha nodded, her pencil flying across the page. The challenges were difficult, but she relished them. Each solved equation felt like a step closer to the future she had dreamed of. As the days turned into weeks, Aisha's confidence grew. Her classmates began to notice her dedication and often whispered about her late-night study sessions with Miss Thompson. Some were curious, others envious, but Aisha paid them no mind. Her focus was unwavering. Miss Thompson, too, found herself changing. Working with Aisha reminded her why she had become a teacher in the first place. The girl's determination and hunger for knowledge reignited something within her, a sense of purpose that had dulled over the years. One evening, as they wrapped up another intense study session, Miss Thompson looked at Aisha with a rare smile. "You're ready for this competition," she said. "You've worked harder than anyone I've ever taught." Aisha felt a surge of pride but quickly tempered it with humility. "I couldn't have done it without you," she admitted. "You've taught me so much." Miss Thompson shook her head. "You've always had this in you, Aisha. I've just helped you see it." As the competition date approached, Aisha threw herself even deeper into her preparations. Every problem she solved and every challenge she tackled brought her closer to the moment she would prove not only her skills, but her resilience. For Miss Thompson, this mentorship became more than just a professional responsibility. It was a personal mission, a chance to nurture a talent she knew could change the world. The day of the National Mathematics Competition arrived, and the atmosphere in the auditorium was electric. Students from across the country filled the large hall, their faces a mix of nervousness and excitement. Aisha stood near the entrance, clutching her notebook tightly. Her heart raced as she scanned the room, feeling the weight of the moment. "You've got this, Aisha," Miss Thompson said, her voice calm and reassuring. She stood beside her, a rare smile on her face. Remember everything we've practiced. Focus, stay calm, and trust yourself. Aisha nodded, her determination outweighing her fear. I'll do my best, she said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. When the competition began, Aisha took her seat among the other participants. The test paper in front of her was filled with intricate problems that would challenge even the most advanced students. She took a deep breath and began. The clock ticked loudly, but Aisha tuned out everything except the numbers and symbols before her. She approached each problem methodically, her pencil gliding across the paper with confidence. There were moments of doubt, moments where she felt stuck, but she pushed through, remembering Miss Thompson's words. You've faced bigger challenges than this. When time was called, Aisha set down her pencil, her hands trembling slightly. She looked at the completed paper, a mix of exhaustion and pride filling her chest. No matter the outcome, she knew she had given it her all. The award ceremony was tense, with participants and their families gathered in anticipation. One by one, the winners were announced. Aisha held her breath as the presenter reached the final name. And first place goes to Aisha Carter. The room erupted into applause, but for Aisha, the sound felt distant. She stood frozen, disbelief washing over her. Miss Thompson nudged her gently, her face glowing with pride. Go on, she said. Aisha stepped onto the stage, the trophy in her hands feeling heavier than she expected. She looked out at the cheering crowd, then at Miss Thompson, who watched from the sidelines with tears in her eyes. At that moment, Aisha realized this wasn't just a victory, it was a turning point. Winning the competition brought more than a trophy. It opened doors she had only dreamed of. Within weeks, Aisha received an offer for a full scholarship to one of the country's most prestigious schools, a place known for its advanced curriculum and opportunities to connect with leading educators. When Aisha arrived at her new school, she was struck by how different it was. The sprawling campus, high-tech classrooms, and impeccably dressed students were a far cry from the modest school she had known. She felt out of place at first, her worn-out notebook a stark contrast to the sleek laptops around her. But she reminded herself of why she was there. This was her chance to build the future she had always dreamed of. The challenges were immediate. The coursework was tougher, and her peers seemed more confident and prepared. But Aisha tackled each obstacle with the same determination that had carried her through the competition. Miss Thompson stayed in touch, offering advice and encouragement whenever Aisha faced moments of doubt. You belong there, Aisha, she would say. Don't ever let anyone make you feel otherwise. By the end of her first semester, Aisha began to find her footing. Teachers praised her for her insight, and classmates started seeking her out for help. Slowly but surely, she began to feel like she belonged. The scholarship wasn't just a prize. It was a bridge to a new world. Aisha knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she also knew she was ready for it. Aisha stepped into the grand hallways of her new school, her worn-out backpack slung over one shoulder. The wide corridors gleamed, and digital boards displayed the day's announcements in bright colors. Around her, students walked in small groups, their uniforms crisp and their laughter confident. Aisha's heart raced as she looked down at her own slightly frayed sweater and weathered notebook. She felt like an outsider, but she refused to let it show. The first few weeks were overwhelming. The curriculum was rigorous, with advanced topics Aisha had only begun to explore. Many of her classmates seemed far ahead, their questions sharp and their confidence unwavering. Aisha often found herself reviewing her notes late into the night, determined to keep up. During a particularly tough physics class, the teacher posed a question that stumped most of the room. Aisha hesitated before raising her hand. Her voice was quiet as she explained her reasoning, but her answer was spot on. The teacher smiled. Correct, Aisha. Well done. The class turned to look at her, some with admiration, others with curiosity. As the lesson continued, a boy leaned over and whispered, You're a genius or something? Aisha didn't respond, but a small smile tugged at her lips. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of confidence. Still, the social aspect of the school proved to be just as challenging as the academics. Lunchtime was the hardest. At her old school, Aisha had always sat alone or with one or two quiet friends. Here, the cafeteria buzzed with conversations, and it seemed like everyone had their group. She often found a corner table where she could eat and study unnoticed. One afternoon, as she reviewed notes during lunch, a girl named Sophia approached her. Sophia was one of the more outspoken students, always surrounded by friends. She placed her tray on the table and sat down. "You're always studying," Sophia said, her tone light. "I could use someone like you for our group project." Aisha blinked, caught off guard. "Me?" "Yes, you," Sophia said with a grin. "You're brilliant, and we need brilliant." Aisha hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." From that moment, Sophia became a surprising ally. The two often worked together, and Sophia's outgoing nature helped Aisha navigate the social landscape of the school. Slowly, other students began to warm up to her, and she started feeling less isolated. Despite the growing connections, Aisha never forgot her roots or the support that had brought her this far. Every Saturday, she called Miss Thompson to share her progress and challenges. Miss Thompson listened intently, her voice filled with pride. "They're so advanced here, Miss Thompson," Aisha admitted during one call. "Sometimes I feel like I'll never catch up." Miss Thompson's tone was firm yet kind. "Aisha, you've already overcome so much. Don't let doubt hold you back. You've proven time and time again that you belong." Her words stayed with Aisha as she tackled each new challenge. She joined the school's math club and participated in internal competitions, gradually earning recognition from both teachers and peers. While the journey wasn't easy, each small victory reminded her of why she was there. Late one night, as Aisha sat in her dorm room, she opened her old notebook. The scribbles and annotations brought back memories of her early struggles and the promises she had made to herself. She ran her fingers over the faded pages, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "This is just the beginning," she whispered, her voice steady. "I can do this." By the end of the semester, Aisha had carved out a space for herself in the school. Her determination and humility set her apart, earning her respect and admiration. While there were still challenges ahead, she knew she was stronger than ever and ready to face whatever came next. Years passed, and Aisha's journey transformed her into a confident and accomplished young woman. By her early 30s, she had achieved more than she had ever imagined. She was now a respected leader, spearheading an educational initiative called Bridge to the Future, aimed at helping gifted children from low-income backgrounds. The program provided scholarships, mentorship, and resources to kids who, like her younger self, dreamed of escaping their circumstances through education. The initiative had grown rapidly, enrolling hundreds of children across the country. Aisha spent her days balancing meetings with educators, visiting schools, and mentoring the students personally. Her schedule was packed, but every interaction reminded her why she started. Seeing the spark in a child's eyes when they solved a difficult problem or received their first scholarship filled her with purpose. One afternoon, Aisha stood at the front of a packed conference room, preparing to present her latest project. The room was filled with educators, philanthropists, and policymakers eager to hear from her. She adjusted the microphone on the podium, her sleek blazer a testament to the transformation she had undergone. "When I was a child," Aisha began, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "I didn't know if I could change my reality. But I believed in one thing: knowledge. It became my lifeline, my escape, and my hope. Today, I want to give that same opportunity to other children because I know how much it can transform lives." The audience listened intently as Aisha outlined her vision for the program's expansion. She spoke about the importance of nurturing potential, especially in children who faced barriers due to their circumstances. Her words were powerful, resonating with everyone in the room. After the presentation, Aisha walked among the crowd, answering questions and sharing stories about the students in her program. One of her mentees, an 8-year-old boy named Malik, approached her with wide eyes. He had recently received a scholarship and excelled in science. "Miss Aisha," Malik said, tugging at her sleeve, "how did you do it? How did you leave where you were and get here?" Aisha knelt to meet his gaze, her smile warm. "With a lot of effort," she said gently, "and because I had people who believed in me. Now it's your turn to believe in yourself." Malik nodded, his face lighting up with hope. Moments like this reminded Aisha of the power of her work, not just in changing lives, but in inspiring others to believe in their potential. Despite her success, Aisha never let go of her past. She often revisited her old school, walking through its familiar hallways and sitting at the desks where her dreams had begun. On her last visit, she found herself in the classroom that once belonged to Miss Thompson. The memories of those early days flooded back, and she felt a surge of gratitude for the teacher who had shaped her path. Miss Thompson had become an integral part of Aisha's life, even after their time together at school. They stayed in touch, their relationship evolving from teacher and student to mentor and mentee, and eventually to friends. Miss Thompson had retired but remained deeply proud of Aisha's accomplishments, often attending events to support her. At one such event, Aisha invited Miss Thompson on stage. "This is the woman who believed in me when I needed it most," Aisha said, holding Miss Thompson's hand. The crowd erupted into applause as the older woman smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "Miss Thompson taught me far more than mathematics," Aisha continued. "She showed me the power of resilience and belief, and today I hope to pass that on to every child in this program." Miss Thompson took the microphone, her voice trembling with emotion. "Aisha's journey has taught me something invaluable, that believing in someone's potential can change not only their life, but your own. She inspired me as much as I inspired her." The applause was deafening, but for Aisha, it wasn't about the recognition. It was about honoring the people and experiences that had shaped her. Bridge to the Future wasn't just a program. It was a reflection of her journey, a way to give back and ensure that other children had the chance to dream big. As the event ended, Aisha stood by the stage, watching the children who had enrolled in her program interact with their mentors. Each smile, each spark of curiosity reminded her of her younger self. She knew her work was far from over, but in that moment, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. "This is only the beginning," she thought, her heart full of gratitude and determination. The auditorium buzzed with excitement as Aisha prepared to celebrate a major milestone for Bridge to the Future, the enrollment of its 1,000th student. It was a day filled with pride and gratitude, a testament to the years of effort she had poured into the program. As she walked onto the stage, the applause from mentors, students, and supporters filled the room. But Aisha's focus was on the faces in the crowd. Her speech was heartfelt. "This program isn't just about education," Aisha said, her voice carrying across the room. "It's about hope, opportunity, and the belief that no matter where you come from, you can achieve greatness." As she scanned the audience, her eyes stopped on a familiar face seated near the back. Miss Thompson. Aisha's breath caught for a moment. Her former teacher looked older, her hair now streaked with gray, and her posture slightly stooped. But her presence was as commanding as ever. Their eyes met, and Miss Thompson offered a tentative smile. Aisha's heart swelled with emotion. After the ceremony, as guests mingled and congratulated her, Aisha made her way through the crowd toward Miss Thompson. When they were face to face, Aisha paused, unsure how to put years of gratitude into words. Miss Thompson broke the silence first. "You've done something extraordinary, Aisha," she said, her voice warm and filled with pride. "I couldn't miss the chance to see it." "Miss Thompson," Aisha began, her voice thick with emotion, "I've wanted to thank you for so long, for everything." Miss Thompson shook her head gently. "Before anything else, I need to apologize," she said, her expression earnest. "I was too hard on you in the beginning. My pride and insecurities got in the way, and you deserve better." Aisha smiled softly, her eyes glistening. "You were tough, yes, but you also taught me resilience and pushed me to be better. You believed in me when it mattered most, and I'll never forget that." Miss Thompson hesitated, then reached out to take Aisha's hands. "You've always had something special, Aisha. I only wish I'd seen it sooner. Watching you today, I realize just how much you've accomplished and how much you've inspired me." The two women embraced, a moment rich with meaning. For Miss Thompson, it was a chance to finally reconcile with the past. For Aisha, it was the closure she hadn't realized she needed. Aisha stepped back and gestured toward the stage. "Come with me," she said, her smile widening. "There's someone the audience needs to meet." Miss Thompson hesitated but allowed Aisha to guide her onto the stage. The room fell silent as Aisha took the microphone. "Everyone, I'd like to introduce someone who played a pivotal role in my journey," Aisha said, her voice steady. "Miss Thompson wasn't just my math teacher. She was the first person who challenged me to believe in myself." The crowd erupted into applause as Miss Thompson stood beside her, visibly moved. Aisha handed her the microphone, encouraging her to speak. Miss Thompson's hands trembled slightly as she addressed the audience. "I've spent my career teaching students, but the truth is, I've learned just as much from them," she began. "Aisha taught me that believing in someone's potential can change lives, and she changed mine." The applause grew louder, but for Aisha and Miss Thompson, the moment felt deeply personal. They exchanged a glance, both feeling the weight of the journey that had brought them there. As the event wound down, Aisha and Miss Thompson walked together, talking like old friends. At the entrance, Miss Thompson turned to her. "You haven't just built a future for yourself, Aisha. You've built futures for thousands of children. That's something the world will never forget." Aisha smiled, her heart full. "I learned that from you, Miss Thompson. To believe in people, even when it's hard." As Miss Thompson walked away, Aisha stood quietly, watching her retreating figure. The past had come full circle, and for the first time, Aisha felt at peace with where she had been and where she was going. The sun shone brightly over the bustling campus of Bridge to the Future, where children from all over the country gathered for their first day of classes. Aisha stood at the front of a small group of students, smiling as they listened intently to her words of encouragement. "Each of you has the potential to do incredible things," she said, her voice steady and warm. "This is where your journey begins. But remember, the real power lies in believing in yourself and never giving up." The students nodded eagerly, their eyes filled with the same hope Aisha once carried. As she walked among them, she couldn't help but see pieces of herself in their curious faces. The hunger to learn, the resilience to overcome, and the quiet determination to succeed. Later that evening, Aisha sat in her office, reviewing reports for the program's next phase. Among the stacks of papers and notebooks, she noticed something familiar: her old math notebook. Its edges were frayed, and the pages yellowed with time, but it still held the scribbled equations and dreams that had fueled her journey. She opened the notebook and ran her fingers over the faded writing. Memories flooded her mind, solving problems by the dim light of her lamp, her parents' arguments echoing in the background, and Miss Thompson's voice challenging her to push further. This notebook wasn't just a relic of her past. It was a testament to how far she had come. Later that evening, Aisha sat in her office, reviewing reports for the program's next phase. Among the stacks of papers and notebooks, she noticed something familiar: her old math notebook. Its edges were frayed, and the pages yellowed with time, but it still held the scribbled equations and dreams that had fueled her journey. She opened the notebook and ran her fingers over the faded writing. Memories flooded her mind, solving problems by the dim light of her lamp, her parents' arguments echoing in the background, and Miss Thompson's voice challenging her to push further. This notebook wasn't just a relic of her past. It was a testament to how far she had come.